Richard stared at the last $15 in his wallet. It was madness. Complete madness. He just worked a brutal double shift at Penn Presbyterian, his back screaming from that industrial sprayer pack, his hands raw from bleach. This money was supposed to buy May's dinner, the only real meal his 7-year-old daughter would get today. But the woman in the red sweater standing in the dark parking lot on Powelton Avenue kept fumbling with her purse, her voice breaking, and he couldn't walk away. Not when he recognized that kind of terror in her eyes. The woman's name was Brenda, and she was begging a medical courier to wait just 5 more minutes. Her daughter, Chloe, was inside the emergency room, and the courier had arrived with a rare blood-clotting agent that could save her life. But there was a $15 cash-on-delivery processing fee, and somehow, impossibly, every one of Brenda's cards had been declined. A banking glitch. A frozen account. It didn't matter why. What mattered was that her daughter might die because she couldn't produce $15 in cash. So Richard gave it to her. Every dollar. She clutched the bills like they were made of gold, thanked him with a sob, and rushed back into the hospital emergency entrance. And Richard adjusted the heavy sprayer on his back and started the long walk home to North Philly, wondering how he'd explain to May why there'd be nothing on the table tonight. The next morning, someone knocked on his door. When Richard opened it, his breath caught in his throat. 7 Rolls-Royces lined his narrow street. Neighbors were pouring out of their homes. Phones up, recording. Men in tailored suits were stepping out of the vehicles. And walking toward him, dressed like royalty, was her, the desperate woman from the parking lot. Only now she looked like someone who could buy his entire block without checking the price. Mr. Richard, she said, a healthy little girl holding her hand. We need to talk. What happened next changed Richard's life forever. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it reminds us that hope and second chances are universal languages. Richard didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He kept thinking about May's face when he told her there was no dinner, and how she just nodded and said it was okay. 7 years old, and already too familiar with hunger. He'd walked home from the hospital because he had no money for the bus, and every step reminded him that he'd just given away the only thing standing between his daughter and an empty stomach. But he didn't regret it. He couldn't. That woman had been desperate, and Richard knew desperation better than most people. So he'd given her the money and walked home, and now he was lying in bed trying to figure out how to make it through the week. Morning came too fast. Richard had just got May ready for school when someone knocked on his door. 3 hard knocks that sounded important. What Richard found on the other side of that door didn't make sense. 7 Rolls-Royces were parked on a street. 7. Each one worth more than his entire neighborhood, probably. People in expensive suits were getting out of the cars, and neighbors were already gathering to watch whatever was happening. Then Richard saw her, the woman from the parking lot, Brenda, except she didn't look like the desperate, crying woman he'd met last night. She looked like money, serious money, the kind of money that changed lives with a phone call. She had a little girl with her, healthy, smiling, alive, the daughter who'd been dying 12 hours ago. Brenda walked up to Richard and told him she'd come to thank him. She said he'd save her daughter's life with those $15. She said she wanted to repay him. Richard told her she didn't need to repay him. He was just glad her daughter was okay. That's when the old man stepped out of the lead car, Arthur Sterling, Brenda's father. He looked at Richard the way rich people sometimes looked at janitors, like they were part of the furniture. Arthur didn't shake Richard's hand. He just studied him with cold eyes and introduced himself. Then Arthur did something Richard didn't expect. He pulled out a checkbook and wrote a check for $50,000. $50,000. Richard had never seen that many zeros on a check before. Arthur held it out and told Richard to take it. He said it was payment for helping his granddaughter, fair compensation for the $15. But there was something in Arthur's voice that made Richard pause. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else. Something that felt like a test. Arthur told Richard to take the money and forget this ever happened. He said Richard should stay away from Brenda and get on with his life. He said $50,000 could change everything for a man like Richard. New apartment, better job, security for his daughter. Richard looked at that check. $50,000. It was more money than he'd see in years of working at the hospital. It could solve every problem he had. May could have new clothes, good food, a better school. They could move out of this neighborhood. They could have a real life. But something about the way Arthur said, a man like Richard, made his stomach turn. Something about being told to forget and stay away felt wrong. Richard had given Brenda that money because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted a reward. And now this old man was trying to turn it into a transaction. So Richard did something that probably wasn't smart. He refused a check. He told Arthur he didn't save a life for money. He said he did it because it was right, and you don't put a price on doing the right thing. He said he didn't want to be paid off and told to disappear. Arthur's face changed when Richard said that. The cold look got colder. He put the check back in his pocket and told Richard he was making a mistake. He said Richard didn't understand who he was dealing with. He said men who refused Arthur Sterling's generosity usually regretted it. Then Arthur got back in his Rolls-Royce and drove away, taking most of the other cars with him. But Brenda stayed. She stood there on Richard's broken front step with her daughter Chloe, and she looked at Richard like she was seeing him for the first time. She told him she was sorry about her father. She said Arthur was used to solving problems with money, and he didn't know how to handle someone who couldn't be bought. Brenda asked if she could come inside. She said she wanted to meet May. She said Chloe should meet the daughter of the man who saved her life. Richard let them in, even though his apartment was small and shabby and nothing like the world these people came from. May was shy at first, but Chloe was friendly and sweet, and within minutes the two girls were sitting on the floor playing with May's worn-out toys like they'd been friends forever. Brenda sat at Richard's kitchen table and told him the truth. She was the heiress to Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Her family was worth billions. She'd been at the hospital because Chloe had a rare bleeding disorder, and the treatment had to be delivered on site. The banking glitch that froze her accounts had been her father's doing. Arthur had been trying to teach her a lesson about independence, about not relying on the family money. But the lesson had almost killed her daughter. Brenda said she'd spent the whole night thinking about Richard, about how he'd given his last $15 to a stranger, about how he'd walked home in the dark so her daughter could live, about how he'd done it without asking who she was or what he'd get in return. She said that kind of goodness was rare, especially in her world. Richard didn't know what to say to that. He just watched his daughter play with this little rich girl, and for a moment, they looked like any two kids. No difference. No money or poverty between them. Just two 7-year-olds being friends. Brenda asked Richard if she could see him again, not because she owed him, not because of money, but because she wanted to know him. She wanted to understand what kind of man gave away his last dollar for a stranger. Richard said yes, even though he knew it was complicated, even though he knew her father would hate it, even though he knew their worlds didn't match. He said yes because when Brenda looked at him, she didn't see a janitor. She saw Richard, just Richard, and that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next few weeks were strange for Richard. Brenda started visiting him regularly, always bringing Chloe to play with May. The two girls became inseparable, which meant Richard and Brenda spent a lot of time together too. They'd sit in his small kitchen drinking cheap coffee while the girls played, and they'd talk about everything. Brenda told Richard about growing up in her father's world, about how Arthur had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals from nothing, and how that success had turned him into someone who measured everything in dollars, about how her mother had died when she was young, and Arthur had raised her to be tough, to never show weakness, to never trust anyone who might want the family money. Richard told Brenda about his life too, about how his wife had left when May was 2, said she couldn't handle being poor anymore, about how he'd been working as a janitor at Penn Presbyterian for 8 years, invisible to most of the people who walked past him every day, about how May was the only good thing in his life, and how he'd do anything to give her a better future. Brenda listened to all of it without judgment. She didn't try to fix his problems with money. She didn't offer him charity. She just listened, and that meant more to Richard than any check could. But Arthur was watching. Richard knew it even though he couldn't prove it. Strange things started happening. His hours at work got cut. His landlord suddenly wanted to raise the rent. His car, the beat-up old Honda he'd saved 2 years to buy, broke down, and the mechanic told him someone had put sugar in the gas tank. Richard knew Arthur was behind it. The old man was trying to pressure him, trying to make his life so difficult that he'd either take the money and disappear or prove himself unworthy of Brenda. Richard didn't tell Brenda about any of it. He just kept working, kept taking care of May, kept showing up, because that's what Richard did. He didn't give up. Meanwhile, May and Chloe's friendship was changing both girls. May, who'd always been quiet and withdrawn because of their poverty, started smiling more. She started dreaming bigger. Chloe, who'd grown up with everything money could buy, started learning what it meant to appreciate simple things. They'd play in the park for hours, and Chloe would say it was more fun than any expensive toy she owned. One afternoon, Brenda invited Richard and May to her family's estate for dinner. Richard almost said no. He didn't belong in that world. But May's eyes lit up when she heard about it, and Richard couldn't disappoint her. The Sterling estate was like something from a movie. Gates, guards, a driveway longer than Richard's whole street. The house itself was massive, with more rooms than Richard could count. Everything was perfect and expensive and completely overwhelming. Arthur was there waiting for them. He was polite on the surface, but Richard could feel the hostility underneath. Arthur asked Richard about his job, his education, his plans for the future. Every question was designed to highlight the gap between their worlds. Every answer Richard gave seemed to confirm Arthur's belief that Richard wasn't good enough for his daughter. Dinner was uncomfortable. Richard used the wrong fork twice. He didn't know what half the food was. May was scared to touch anything because everything looked too expensive. Chloe tried to make them feel better, but it was hard when even the chairs they sat on probably cost more than Richard's monthly rent. After dinner, Arthur asked to speak with Richard privately. They went to Arthur's study, a room full of expensive books and awards and photos of Arthur with presidents and celebrities. Arthur poured himself a drink and got straight to the point. He told Richard he knew what was happening between him and Brenda. He said he looked into Richard's background, the poverty, the failed marriage, the years of minimum wage work. He said Richard was clearly a decent man, but decency wasn't enough. Brenda needed someone who could match her, someone who could handle the pressure of the Sterling name, someone who understood how power worked. Arthur said Richard was out of his depth. He said Brenda was going through a phase, romanticizing Richard's simple life. But eventually she'd realize she couldn't give up her world for his. And when that happened, it would hurt both of them. Better to end it now before anyone got too attached. Then Arthur made another offer, $100,000. Tax-free. Enough to move Richard and May somewhere nice, give them a fresh start, secure May's future. All Richard had to do was walk away from Brenda. Tell her he couldn't do this anymore. Make it clean. Richard looked at Arthur and understood something in that moment. The old man wasn't evil. He was scared. Scared of losing his daughter to someone he couldn't control. Scared that Richard would hurt her. Scared that love didn't follow the rules Arthur had spent his whole life mastering. Richard told Arthur he understood why he was doing this. He said he'd be scared too if he were a father watching his daughter fall for someone from a completely different world. But Richard said he wasn't going to take the money. Not because he didn't need it. God knows he needed it. But because Brenda deserved to make her own choices. She deserved to decide who was worthy of her, not have her father decide for her. Richard told Arthur that if Brenda wanted him to leave, he'd leave, but it had to be her choice. Arthur's face hardened. He said Richard had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He said he'd given Richard 2 chances to do the smart thing, and Richard had refused both times. He said Richard would regret this. Richard left his estate that night, knowing he'd just made a powerful enemy. But he also left knowing he'd done the right thing. He'd stood up for himself, for Brenda, for the idea that love was worth more than money. What he didn't know was that Brenda had been listening outside the study door. She'd heard everything. Her father's threats, Richard's refusals, the way Richard had defended her right to choose. And that's when Brenda realized she was in love with him. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens to them. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never another amazing stories from me. Arthur's campaign against Richard escalated. Within a week, Richard lost his job at the hospital. The official reason was budget cuts, but Richard knew better. Arthur had made a phone call, pulled some strings, and now Richard was unemployed. Without income, Richard couldn't pay rent. His landlord, who suddenly had a new Rolex and a nervous smile, gave him 30 days to vacate. Richard tried to find another job, but everywhere he applied, he got the same response. They'd seem interested until they checked his references, and then suddenly the position was filled. Arthur was blacklisting him, quietly, efficiently, making sure Richard couldn't survive in Philadelphia. Richard didn't tell Brenda how bad things had gotten. He couldn't. She was already fighting with her father constantly because of him. If she knew Richard was being destroyed financially, she'd confront Arthur. And Richard didn't want to be the cause of her losing her family. But May noticed. 7-year-olds are smart that way. She noticed they were eating less. She noticed her dad was stressed all the time. She noticed they were packing boxes. One night, May asked Richard if they were moving because of Chloe's family. Richard tried to lie, tried to tell her everything was fine. But May looked at him with those wise, sad eyes and said, "It's okay, Daddy. We don't need fancy things. We just need each other." That broke something in Richard. His daughter was 7 years old and already accepting poverty like it was inevitable, already learning to expect less from life. And it was killing Richard that he couldn't give her more. The next day, Brenda showed up at Richard's apartment unannounced. She took one look at the packed boxes, the eviction notice on the table, Richard's exhausted face, and she knew. She knew what her father had done. Brenda was furious. She told Richard she was going to fix this. She said she'd talk to her father, threatened him, cut him off if she had to. She said Richard and May could move into her house, and she'd take care of everything. But Richard said no. He said he appreciated it. But he couldn't let her fight his battles. He couldn't let her throw away her relationship with her father because of him. He said maybe Arthur was right. Maybe they were from 2 different worlds. And maybe trying to bridge that gap was just causing pain for everyone. Brenda asked Richard if he was giving up on them. Richard said he wasn't giving up. He was being realistic. He said he loved her, and this was the first time he'd said it out loud. But he couldn't watch her destroy her life for him. Brenda said she loved him too. She said she'd choose him over money, over her father, over everything. But she needed Richard to fight with her, not surrender. That's when Richard told her the truth. He told her about the job loss, the blacklisting, the eviction. He told her about May's quiet acceptance of their poverty and how it broke his heart. He told her he felt worthless, like he was failing everyone, his daughter, Brenda, himself. Brenda held him while he cried. Richard hadn't cried in years, but everything just poured out of him. All the shame, all the fear, all the exhaustion of trying to be strong when the whole world was pushing him down. When Richard finally stopped, Brenda told him she had a plan. She said her father was hosting a charity gala in 2 days at the Union League. All of Philadelphia's elite would be there. She said she was going to bring Richard as her date, and she was going to publicly stand up to her father in front of everyone he knew. Richard said that was crazy. He said Arthur would humiliate him in front of all those people. Brenda said maybe, but she was done letting her father control her life. She said she was choosing Richard, and she wanted everyone to know it. Richard agreed, even though he was terrified. He didn't have clothes for a fancy gala. Brenda bought him a suit, and before Richard could protest, she said it wasn't charity. It was war preparation. They were going into battle, and Richard needed armor. The night of the gala arrived. Richard had never been so nervous in his life. The Union League was filled with millionaires and power players. Everyone was wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Waiters walked around with champagne and caviar. A string quartet played classical music. Richard felt like an imposter. Even in his new suit, he felt like everyone could see through him, could see the janitor, the poor man, the guy who didn't belong. But Brenda held his hand and introduced him to everyone like he was the most important person in the room. She told people Richard had saved her daughter's life. She told them he was the kindest man she'd ever met. She said it with pride, with love, and people listened because Brenda Sterling didn't praise people lightly. Arthur watched all of it from across the room. His face was stone. Richard could feel the anger radiating from him. Halfway through the night, Arthur made his move. He called for everyone's attention and announced a special presentation. He said he wanted to honor the man who'd saved his granddaughter's life. He called Richard up to the front of the room. Richard's stomach dropped. This wasn't an honor. This was a trap. Arthur started by thanking Richard for his heroism. Then he started asking questions. Innocent questions at first. Where did Richard work? What did he do? How long had he been a janitor? With each question, Arthur was subtly reminding everyone in the room of Richard's low status. Then Arthur mentioned the $50,000 reward he'd offered Richard. He said Richard had refused it. He asked the crowd if they knew anyone else who'd refused $50,000. The implication was clear. Something was wrong with Richard. Normal people took money when it was offered. Only someone with ulterior motives would refuse. Then Arthur dropped his bomb. He said his watch had gone missing tonight. A Patek Philippe worth $200,000. He said it had been in his jacket pocket, and now it was gone. He said he hated to suggest anything, but Richard had been near his jacket earlier in the evening. The room went silent. People stared at Richard. Security guards moved toward him. Richard felt the world closing in. This was it. Arthur had framed him. He'd planted his own watch somewhere in Richard's clothes or planted evidence that Richard had taken it. Richard was about to be arrested in front of all these people, humiliated, destroyed. But then Brenda stepped forward. She told her father to stop. She said she knew exactly what he was doing, and she wouldn't let him frame an innocent man. She said she'd been with Richard all night, and he hadn't been anywhere near Arthur's jacket. Arthur told Brenda to stay out of it. He said the watch was missing, and Richard was the only person who'd been close enough to take it. That's when Brenda made her choice. She told her father she was done. Done with his manipulation, his control, his cruelty. She said she loved Richard, and if Arthur wanted to destroy him, he'd have to destroy her too. She said she'd walk away from the Sterling name, the money, everything, before she let her father hurt the man she loved. The room was silent. Everyone was watching Arthur and Brenda, father and daughter, a battle of wills. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man at one of the tables started choking. He clutched his throat, his face turning red. People panicked. Someone screamed for help. Richard moved without thinking. Years of working at a hospital had taught him basic emergency response. He ran to the choking man and performed the Heimlich maneuver. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th thrust, a piece of steak flew out of the man's mouth. The man gasped, breathing again. The room erupted in relief. People clapped. The elderly man, who turned out to be a federal judge, thanked Richard with tears in his eyes. Arthur stood there watching. His trap had been forgotten in the chaos. His attempt to humiliate Richard had backfired because Richard had just saved someone's life in front of everyone. More importantly, Arthur had seen something in that moment. He'd seen Richard move without hesitation, without thought for himself, to save a stranger. Just like he'd saved Chloe. Just like he'd given Brenda those $15. Arthur had spent the whole night trying to prove Richard was a fraud, a gold digger, someone unworthy. But in that moment, Richard had proven exactly who he was. A man who helped people. A man who gave without expecting anything back. A man whose first instinct was always to do the right thing. Arthur left the gala without saying goodbye to anyone. He went home, sat in his study, and thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the kind of man Richard was versus the kind of man he'd assumed Richard to be. He thought about his daughter's happiness versus his own pride. And for the first time in decades, Arthur Sterling admitted he'd been wrong. 3 days after the gala, Richard was helping May pack their things and move. He'd found a cheaper apartment across town. Nothing great, but it was all he could afford. Brenda had offered again to help, but Richard had refused. He needed to do this on his own, needed to prove he could take care of his daughter without charity. Someone knocked on the door. Richard opened it expecting the landlord, but instead found Arthur Sterling standing there. Alone. No bodyguards. No Rolls-Royce. Just an old man in a simple suit, looking uncomfortable and tired. Arthur asked if they could talk. Richard almost said no, but something in Arthur's face made him agree. They sat at Richard's kitchen table, the same table where Brenda had first told him her story weeks ago. Arthur started by apologizing. He said he'd spent the last 3 days thinking about Richard, about Brenda, about what kind of father he'd become. He said when Brenda's mother died, he'd built walls around himself and his daughter. He'd taught Brenda to measure people by their bank accounts because money was the only thing he understood, the only thing that felt safe. But watching Richard at the gala, watching him save that man without hesitation, Arthur had realized something. Richard had given away $15 when he had nothing. He'd refused $50,000 when he needed everything. He'd saved a life at the gala when he could have just walked away and let someone else handle it. Arthur said that kind of character couldn't be bought or taught. It was just who Richard was. And Arthur had been so afraid of losing control, so afraid of Brenda choosing someone he couldn't manipulate, that he'd try to destroy the best thing that had ever happened to her. Richard didn't say anything. He just listened while this powerful man who tried to ruin him admitted he'd been wrong. Arthur said he'd made calls that morning. Richard's job at the hospital was waiting for him if he wanted it back. The eviction was canceled. The blacklist was lifted. Arthur had undone everything he'd done to hurt Richard. But more than that, Arthur said he wanted to apologize to May. He said he'd been punishing an innocent child because of his own fear, and that was unforgivable. He asked if May could come out so he could tell her himself. Richard called May from her room. She came out shyly, unsure of who this man was or why he was crying. Arthur got down on one knee, something he probably hadn't done in decades, and told May he was sorry. He said he'd been mean to her daddy, and that was wrong. He said May's father was one of the best men he'd ever met, and May should be proud of him. May looked at Richard, confused. Richard nodded, tears in his own eyes. Then Arthur did something that shocked Richard completely. He said if Richard would accept it, Arthur would like to help May. Not charity, not pay off money, but help. He said May deserved a good education, a safe home, opportunities that Richard couldn't afford on a janitor's salary. He said it would be his honor to invest in May's future because she was the daughter of the man who'd saved his granddaughter. Richard wanted to refuse. His pride screamed at him to say no. But then he looked at May, at her hopeful face, and he realized this wasn't about him. This was about giving his daughter the future she deserved. And sometimes accepting help wasn't weakness. It was love. So Richard said yes. He said yes to the education fund. Yes to Arthur's support. Yes to letting May have the opportunities he'd never had. Arthur stood up and shook Richard's hand. Really shook it this time. Not as a rich man greeting a poor man, but as one father respecting another father. Then Arthur said there was one more thing. He said Brenda had been staying with friends since the gala, refusing to come home until Arthur apologized to Richard. He said she loved Richard more than Arthur had thought possible, and if Richard loved her the same way, Arthur would like to give them his blessing. Richard said he did love her. He said Brenda had seen past everything, his poverty, his job, his worn-out clothes, and loved him for who he was. He said she'd been willing to give up everything for him, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted that choice. Arthur smiled, a real smile this time. He said Richard was exactly the kind of man Brenda needed. Not someone she could control, but someone who'd stand beside her as an equal. Someone who'd challenge her, support her, love her without conditions. The wedding happened 3 months later. It was small by Sterling standards, but huge by Richard's. They held it in Fairmount Park, where May and Chloe used to play together. No fancy ballroom. No expensive decorations. Just family and friends and love. May and Chloe were flower girls, wearing matching dresses and giggling the whole way down the aisle. Arthur walked Brenda to Richard, and when he placed her hand in Richard's, he whispered something only they could hear. "Take care of my daughter, and let her take care of you." Richard promised he would. The reception was at Arthur's estate, but it was different this time. Richard didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like family. People from the hospital came. Richard's neighbors came. May's teacher came. And they all mixed with the wealthy guests. And somehow it worked because love had brought them all together. Late in the evening, Richard found himself standing alone for a moment, watching May and Chloe dance together on the lawn. Brenda came up beside him and took his hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Richard thought about that night in the parking lot, about the $15, about how desperate and lost he'd felt, and how giving away his last money had somehow led him here, to this moment, to this life. "I'm thinking about how everything changed because I did the right thing," Richard said. "How I almost didn't. How I almost walked away." Brenda squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you didn't." "Me too," Richard said. They stood there together, watching their daughters play, and Richard realized something important. He'd spent years feeling worthless because he didn't have money, didn't have status, didn't have the things society said made a man valuable. But he'd been wrong. His worth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in moments, like giving away his last $15 to save a life, in refusing to be bought, in choosing integrity over comfort, in being the kind of father May could be proud of. Arthur came up beside them, Chloe in his arms. The old man looked at Richard and smiled. "Thank you," Arthur said. "For what?" Richard asked. "For teaching an old fool that the most valuable things in life are the things you can't buy," Arthur said. "For showing me what real wealth looks like." Richard didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and Arthur nodded back, and they stood there together, janitor and billionaire, watching their family. May ran up and hugged Richard's leg. "Daddy, are we rich now?" Richard picked up his daughter and held her close. He looked at Brenda, at Chloe, at Arthur, at all the people who become his family. "Yeah, baby," Richard said. "We're rich now. Richer than I ever thought possible." And for the first time in his life, Richard actually believed it, because he'd learned that wealth wasn't about money in the bank. It was about having people who loved you, who'd fight for you, who'd stand beside you when the whole world tried to push you down. It was about giving your last $15 to a stranger and having it change your entire life. It was about being rich in the ways that actually mattered. And Richard had more of that kind of wealth than he ever thought possible. The end. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. Sometimes giving away everything you have is how you gain everything you need. And sometimes the richest people in the world are the ones who understand that love, integrity, and compassion are worth more than all the money in the world combined. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you like part 2. What challenges will they face as a new blended family? Let me know if you want to hear more.